This is Writer Life, a podcast about writing, life, coffee and conversation, with Rob and John Morgan.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Writer Life. It's kind of interesting, some of the conversations that I have with people. I cover so many different subjects with people when I'm having a talk, and people will kind of give me little hints about what aspects of books they like and so forth, and then they ask me questions, and I love that because there are so many layers to my stories, and it's wonderful that people ask me what is my idea behind a book. I mean, I get asked quite a lot, how do you do this, how do you write? It's a part of life and a part of your soul, I think, that goes into the creation of the kind of stories that you put together. I'm told quite a lot that writing is magical. And I've got to admit, I agree. The written word has to be one of the world's greatest achievements. I mean, if you think about it, you can put these little symbols on a paper and it can go all around the world and everyone will understand you. And it doesn't matter what your cultural heritage is or your background. I mean, it's just such a remarkable achievement. You can express a feeling, an emotion, make people laugh, make people cry, lift someone's day, or lower it, all from these tiny little symbols that we scratch onto paper or these days type on a computer. Creating characters, making worlds, and then allowing everything to mingle. It is a magical experience. But I think, when I sit back and I really look at the way in which I write, I think it's more of a feeling, sort of a stillness within that drives me forward with the words. And that is kind of coupled with everything I've ever seen or heard or done in my life. It really is an odd thing to be a writer. Most of the time you zone out and some other aspects of your being just takes over. You really are so involved with the current story that you're working on, which if it's of your own creation. Your fingers just type to some unseen flow of creativity within you as you drift in a transcendental-like state. When the book is complete, you know in your heart that it's a good story, but you do doubt your own ability, even more so when it's time for a book to be released. I'm not sure if it matters really whether it's your first or your 20th book. That moment always arrives when the key is pressed and a new book is released into the world, and you silently pray that it is loved by everyone and not hated too much. It really is, an odd thing. And the strangest thing about it is that no matter how much you really do love the story you've created, it's going to be judged by the number of sales. And a book that you've adored writing, it may sell a lot less copies than another one that you've done that you know is good, but you just did not realize how much people would take it into their hearts, and it sells beyond anything that you actually expected. It's kind of like gambling or wishing. You want every reader to love it as much as you do, but the simple truth is your belief is not enough. In order for it to hold mass appeal, to be accepted, you need to add something else. Because, book sales are very, very hit and miss. I mean, in a sense, the same can be said for the actual process of writing. One thing I've noticed is how people pick up on different aspects of the kind of sorts of stories that I write. And they really do take those moments to heart. And surprisingly, they remember them. They have their favourite moments, their favourite pieces. I have so many aspects of my writing that I hold very, very dear to me. I mean, some of them can be funny, aspects of a story, or moments of absolute creative inspiration, or simply something so powerful and emotional that when I read them back, I was really thrilled with the depth of that moment, which I, had created. Recently I had a conversation, and part of that conversation was the question, which part of my writing pleased me the most? Now, it is an odd question to be asked. And I'll admit, once a book is completed, it's not always possible to remember every single aspect of it, because I move straight away into another project. And I almost erase the book written prior in some sort of symbolic cleaning of the slate for the next book. When I thought about the question, I think the first thing that came to my mind when I was asked was a moment from Heirs to the Kingdom, from the Circle of Darkness. It's at the start of the book, after the battle outside of the cathedral in Lincoln, where Robbie and Rowan view the scene of devastation left after the Cutters have retreated. And I don't know, I think for me personally, it was a very powerful moment. And it's one aspect of that book, because there's a few really great moments in that book that I remember, but it's one aspect of that book that even now, 3 years on from publishing it, it really does stand out in my mind. And it went kind of like this. Rowan moved closer and lifted his hand to Robbie's shoulder. "Are you okay?" Robbie gave a nod as he turned his head to see the endless fields of trampled mud and red, blood-soaked water that had formed puddles between the dead and the dying. "This is such a waste, Rowan." There really was little response, as he too observed the hundreds of dead from both sides that littered the field. He gave another soft squeeze of Robbie's shoulder to reassure him. Robbie lifted his sleeve and wiped the side of his dirty face. Too many good men have been wounded or lost in battle. Too many mothers have wept at the loss of their sons. Those left standing this day will call themselves the victors. But no one has won here. For if the price to be paid is the spilled blood of good men, then there can be no victory for anyone. War is caused by those few who yearn for greed or for power, and their blood is always too precious to spill on the grass. So innocent men die in their place. Those that start wars always survive them with greater riches or power. Many families weep for the loss of their young. Tell me, Rowan, where is the honour or victory in that? We fight for neither. Robbie, we fight for survival. For if we lose, the likes of Mason will wipe us from this land forever. Robbie gave a silent nod and turned to face him. It is all we can do, but think about the cost in lives. I do not do this for money or power. And if I could choose now in this moment the result, it would be to resolve this without bloodshed. For myself, this passage, it holds a lot of meaning because in truth I'm very, very against war. And yet, having grown up knowing and listening to people who I know served in World War II, and hearing their stories, I admired their ability to face such horrors and, come away from that intact. It's a curious thing, because I know someone who survived Dunkirk, and they spoke little of their time there, but they actually spoke to me, and they told me tales of how men buried their heads in the sand out of the fear to the endless torture of the loud wailing of the German planes that fired upon them as they flew over the beaches. They talked about how the sea was coloured red with blood from the thousands of dead being lifted and rocked by the waves that washed them back onto the beaches. I saw the sadness in his eyes as he talked with a soft, reflective voice of how he watched his best friends die and how he never understood why he survived and they didn't. And he talked of the guilt he felt, leaving his friends dead on the beach as he finally swam out to a small boat free of the horror of that awful beach, which he told me was the real hell in this world. My old friend Doug lived past his 90th year. He was 20 when he was conscripted during World War II, and he was almost 23 when he swam to freedom in that small boat bobbing on the water in France. He came home, he got 2 weeks of leave, and then he was shipped off to Africa, where he served out the rest of the war doing his duty for his country. Doug then spent a further 70 years of his life haunted by what he witnessed and suffering the nightmares in his sleep. He once told me he had no fear of death. If anything, he was looking forward to the peace of mind it would give him. It was those conversations with my friend Doug that led to the way I modelled Robbie's thoughts in Heirs to the Kingdom. And that scene between him and Rowan was in many ways my tribute to an old friend, because it did reflect a few of the things that he said to me. It's something I thought often about. A great many soldiers came back from the war wounded or damaged in some way. They told their stories, and yet so little has happened as a result. If anything, we just go blindly on repeating the same mistakes, never really learning from anything that has happened in the past. You know, today in Ukraine, there is another war in Europe. There are actually many wars going on all over the world at the moment. There's so many that the news channels just, they no longer bother to report them. How many Ukrainian and Russian mothers have wept of late for the loss of their children? My character Robbie was right. If the price to be paid is the spilled blood of good men, then there can be no victory for anyone. So I asked the question, how many shareholders have received bonus checks of late because the profit from the sale of arms has risen so high? For me, it's not about the politics or taking sides. We live in a world where, rather than work for peace, the United States, the United Kingdom and Europe have instead made huge profits from arming one side, whilst China and the other countries have benefited from arming Russia. And caught in the middle are the poor people of Ukraine. You know, has anyone on either side, in any large corporation or any government, wept for them as their children were brutally bombed and shot by the weapons that they have supplied? As a writer, I look at these things and then find a way to work them into the stories that I create. I mean, to a degree, I feel in one sense it is the duty of a writer to highlight the hypocrisy of the world in such a way that it does help others to understand the meaning of injustice. I also write to show the humanity of our race, and hopefully from that, some people will actually learn. Once again in Heirs to the Kingdom, Robbie sits in the garden of Runestone in the sunlight reading. Now Rune notices the books and she asks him, what he's reading. And you have to understand that Rune is the Earth Faith, a people who have suffered in the past from Christian persecution. So when Robbie answers her, she's a little bit surprised at his choice of literature. Rune sat on the wall and passed him a drink. "What you reading?" He opened the cover and looked. "I think Sister Mary left this in my bag. There was a marker in it, so I thought I would read it." "Isn't that a Christian book?" Robbie looked at her odd expression and he smiled. "This little story here is actually quite good, and I've thought about it a lot." Rune looked at him with an even stranger manner. "You're not thinking of becoming one, are you?" He started to laugh at her. "Rune, I'm just reading this one story about a man called the Samaritan who helps a stranger who has been badly hurt. It's interesting, because the men of the church walked right past him and refused to help him. But this Samaritan is supposed to be this man's enemy, and yet he helps him. I think this Samaritan guy is actually quite cool." Roone relaxed. Oh, okay. That's all right then. I cannot deny, the story of the Good Samaritan is a story that resonates very deeply within me. And to a degree, I added it to the kingdom stories after hearing the truth of my own grandfather for the very first time. My grandfather was in World War I. He was stationed in France and fought on what was named Manchester Hill, which, to be honest, was not so much a hill as a long mound of earth high enough for a soldier to lie behind. Him and a small group of men held that place, holding back the German army, which gave the British behind them time to retreat. Almost all of my grandfather's company was wiped out in what was a very long standoff. My grandfather was shot in the head, and when the British retreated, he was left for dead on the battlefield. They literally left him there to die, and yet he lived, and he survived the war. His survival took the form of a German soldier who lifted him up and carried him from the battlefield to a battle hospital, where he was treated, and as a result he survived the war. Now, just like the Samaritan, the enemy saved his life, which is a very good thing, because had they just ignored him and left him to die, things would have been very, very different indeed. In Heir to the Kingdom, I write of how the magic mysteriously weaves around us all, and it's not until the moment that it's actually woven itself completely that we truly do understand how it enhances the lives that we all live. My grandfather was healed and then taken to a prisoner of war camp, and after World War I he came home. A decade later, in 1938, my father was born. I owe my existence to that German soldier, the so-called enemy, whose humanity was greater than those of the British Army, who left my grandfather for dead on the battlefield. Now for me, it is a reminder that soldiers they're not different, they're just like us. Like my grandfather, he was probably conscripted and forced to fight for the honour of his country. And he too probably did not want to be on that battlefield any more than my grandfather did. And maybe he understood things in a way that many today do not, which is why he saved his enemy. I would love to know that German soldier's name and find out if he had any family. For I would actually contact them and offer them my hearty thanks, for without their relative, I simply would not be here. That biblical tale holds a great deal of affection for me. It's one made more powerful by an act of kindness beyond all comprehension, which I feel highlights the humanity of all of us on this planet, and especially has an impact on my own life, which is why these little moments in the things that I write hold a very deep meaning. It means a great deal. I do believe the common soldier does not want to fight and kill. I would imagine that most soldiers would much rather be home, cuddled up to a loved one, or spending times of peace with their family, playing with their children, or being around their friends. The horrors of war are well documented, and so are the mental health issues that follow them. And yet we've learned nothing, and we just continue, and the media loves it. It sensationalizes it and reports it on an hourly basis, boosting their income and ratings. I really do find it sad that ordinary men die for those who wish to gain more. Because I really do believe nobody really wants to kill because they're ordered to. I showed this in The Circle of Darkness, where Jade sits with old Joe outside the gates of Locksley. Look, all of us love this place, and we're dedicated to it, and so we'll fight for what we have, because to us it's everything. You think that lot over yonder care about here? They don't give a shit. They ain't fighting for something they love. To them, this is just another dust-up. They have no say in the fighting. What? You don't think they want to fight us? Her surprise made him really smile. Look, what did I tell you at the cabin? Don't you remember all I told you? She shook her head. I remember everything, and I've used it to help Robbie. She sounded a little hurt, and he softened a little. I told you, them lot over yonder are just like us. Don't you remember? Like us, they're farmers, woodcutters and traders. The problem is, they're not from these parts, and the only difference between them and us is that they chose the wrong vest, and this place ain't their home. They don't have the sort of fire in their bellies like we do. The memory of the long conversations they'd had just over a year ago in his old wooden hut deep in the forest came back to her thoughts. Her voice was softer and tinged with affection. I remember. He gave a nod. Just you keep that in your thoughts, and when you sight that bow, think of it and hit him in the leg or arm. She frowned. What? We don't kill him? He shook his head. Only if we have to. The way I see it, if we fill that side over yonder with wounded, they'll writhe and mourn and cause chaos. And they will also get a chance to get away from here and back home to their loved ones. Now, think about it. He has a right tough job on his hands, so let's make it harder, because I'll bet my last bit those buggers would rather be home by a decent fire, a good woman and a pot of hot stew on the stove than be here getting shot at by us. No, little un, we hurt him, and we make him tie himself in knots, dragging him out the way. I reckon a little pain and then a trip home is a much better option for them than trying to kick us off this rock. Old Joe makes one of the most valid points of the whole series, and it really does highlight how, for the woodland people, their fight is not wanted. They just have no choice, because they're facing annihilation. The enemy in this case are the men of Mason Knox. Now, they're not fighting because they want land, resources or riches. They fight because they're forced to. The real reason for the war is just one man's greed for ultimate power. A theme that has been reflected throughout an awful lot of my stories, and it's one I see in many of the other stories from other writers that I read. And if you look back, all of history is littered with people who craved power and became seen as evil. And I often wonder if simply applying for the job in itself is a road to corruption of one form or another. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. That was a phrase coined by the English nobleman Lord Acton in 1857. And looking at the world leaders today, I believe it's as true now as it was back then. The world's leaders could be pushing for peace, the sparing of life, and yet their eyes are set on the power and the greed that will come with vital resources that they can harvest for themselves. A human life has become meaningless. All that matters is power and money in today's modern world. And I find that a very sad reflection of what humanity has become. In Hans Cottage, I wrote what has become known as Shelley and Emily's paradox, which again, is a part of the story that I really did love putting together. And when it was finished, I read it back, and if I had to list some of my favourite parts of my own writing, this part would definitely be on the list for sure. In the whole series of conversations that Shelley and Emily have, I once again show what is a kind of seedier aspect of mankind, as I refer to elements of some people's personalities and how they can be corrupted for power and for greed, and how that is seen and would be seen by another race. See? Is it so far-fetched to think that somewhere on this earth something exists that we do not know about yet? Emmett, every day, as you well know, new species of insects are being discovered in the Amazon and in the deepest parts of the oceans. New creatures are still being found. Now what if there are other intelligent life forms that have seen the wicked and the cruel way we have treated this earth and have decided to stay the hell out of our way? She took a sip of her wine. We're so preoccupied with our own arrogance. We think we're the smartest, and yet we kill and maim each other in wars for money and gain, hunt our fellow creatures for sport, and farm animals that we consider way too dumb to realise for our food. It's utter arrogance to think nothing could exist that may be as intelligent as us. And as an ecologist, you know what? You should know better. We all live in a world today that is not a kind one. I see it and I write about it. And in this case, Shelley makes a really wonderful point about the state of mankind today. We've swarmed the earth, made everything about earning or spending money, and in our rush away from what I see as the natural way of life, which is nature, we've become the most destructive force on the planet. And Shelley once again highlights this as she points out the obvious things to Emily. Okay, I get your point, Shell, and yeah, we've discovered many new life forms as technology has advanced. But Shell, we're talking about fairies, gnomes, sprites and things, and magical beings. You have to admit, there's a massive lack of proof to even give a substantive case. She smiled and gave a small chuckle. You just cannot admit it, can you? Is it so extreme to believe that maybe magic exists and yet you're surrounded by it? Emmy, life in itself is magic. If we're lucky one day, we may have the privilege of creating a new life and growing it inside ourselves like our mothers did, and then give it a free life with birth. I mean, no matter which way you look at it, that is pure magic. I shook my head. Well, biology actually. She shrugged. Biology is the study of life's organisms, not life itself. The life is the magic bit. I mean, hell, a fish evolved into a man. How fucked up is that? And yet it still happened. Shelley's right. Even now we do not really understand the human body as much as we should. I mean, yeah, we understand the organs and the mechanics of the human body. But the force of life, do we really understand that yet? We still have a lot to learn, and yet in our arrogance we assume we know it all and know better. And yet money is paper, and it's valued far higher than a human life these days. Shelley is right. Life in itself is the real magic, a magic we can never understand, but we know it exists, but little value has been placed on it. How sad is that? Real life has to be reflected in stories. I feel for two very, very important reasons. I mean, the first being that the reader needs to be able to identify with some aspect of the content of the story, because without that they lose interest. It is in those moments of recognition that I believe a reader truly embraces the book and will remember it, as they do with Hans Cottage. Now, when it comes to the Curial Chronicles, people will probably remember them for their kind of in-your-face content, which is sexual and at times quite foul-mouthed. And it's a shame, really, because in a way, and I've said this many times, there really is a very, very wonderful story running through the whole series. And it is possibly one of the most beautiful stories I've written. There are also a lot of parts in this story that once again I would say that if I had to pick certain aspects of what I've written, these would be the parts, because they reflect not just me, but quite a lot of people I know and the society from which we come. The most obvious, obviously, is going to be Ronnie's presentation in Abigail's Summer. I mean, after all, it really does reflect a great deal of society today. The same could be said for Abigail's conversation at the end of Abigail's Summer, where she asked the question, why does entities gayness matter? Which leads to the coining of the term curio. It's actually a part of the story I love the most. But later on in the series, in the second book, there's a lot of moments that really do stand out for me, and I still love them as much as I love writing them. You know, one such aspect is Birch's lack of concern over money, and Abby's discomfort with it. You know, which is kind of crazy because, you know, like Birch's parents are quite well off, Abby's parents are definitely very, very well off. And the two of them have grown up in a kind of a similar environment, and yet Birch has learned to hate money. Whereas Abby, you know, who's kind of been a pawn of her family, understands money, but is not at all at ease with it. Birch, it's 4 million bloody quid! I grabbed the bags as she pushed them onto me. She gave a sigh. I know. I transferred the money. You know, Dads, I do wish you'd stop saying it. She heaved up the food bag. Just put these in the middle of the living room. We'll sort them out later. She walked back towards the house and I followed. Please, Birch, can we talk about this? I'm really uncomfortable with all this. She gave a sigh and looked at me. Good, because money should make you feel uncomfortable. Look, Dads, it's meaningless money. Don't you see that? I did nothing to earn it. I reached 21 and suddenly, boom, I had 18 million in the bank. It was just handed to me, and I didn't really want it. All I want is a simple life doing what I love and snuggling up next to you. I'd do that here, or over there across the street. Hell, I would live in a friggin' yurt with you. This, me, you know, and whatever the hell our relationship, friendship is, that means far more to me than money. I looked at her. She was so serious. You're sodding crazy. You know that? She smiled. Yeah, but I'm sodding crazy and rich. Look, we have a wonderful home base now. And Dad's, it's so much more than that. Did you know that Chloe cries at night in her flat? She's working all day and painting all night just to get her name known in the art world. Or did you know that Edwina has spent her whole life savings on her business? And she cannot afford an office in Mutton because they're too damned expensive. Or that Goggle's biggest fear is she'll never lose touch with you. She gets lonely and upset about it. I had no idea, and it took my breath away to know it. Birch gave a nod. Well, I did. And so I bought a house, and Chloe will have a nice place to live with her dream studio. Edwina will have a home base to set up her office, and Goggles can come home to us whenever she wants. And she will have her own room there, just for her. You keep saying 4 million, but it's not. It's the Curio's heartbeat, and we are the owners, and so we can watch over them. Boom. She just exploded my brain. I think that I'm really lucky I've been able to match some amazing characters together in Robbie and Runestone. You know, Branner and Ariel, Shelley and Emily, even to a degree, you know, Felix and Esme. But I cannot deny, you know, out of all the things that I have written today, the Birch and Dudley partnership is by far my most favourite. There's a real magic in the way in which those two have turned out, and I'm so happy with what I've created within the Curio Chronicles. Birch has been such an amazing character to create. She is a genius who borders constantly on the edge of madness, and yet her insight has been some of the best writing I think I've done. Birch is incredibly complex, as is Deadly. And yet, after a great deal of editing, I do feel I've managed to have them flow effortlessly off the page. And their conversations have been some of the most inspiring aspects of their creation. You know, it's so easy to see Birch as kind of deviant and crazy. And yet there are those moments which I really do hope as more people read them, they will see the brilliance of her mind. In Curious Summer, there's one part that I really enjoyed creating, which comes after a night of trauma when they rush to the help of Anthony with a very delicate problem. Later that night, as they curl up together, they talk, and in many ways it highlights how the world has lost sight of what is actually possible and why so many people struggle with life today, fighting their inner selves. What an insane night. Have you seen a lot of things like this? She was quiet, and I got the impression she was remembering events. She looks at me with those green eyes that twinkled. I've seen and heard some weird bloody things, Dads. But it fascinates me because it still amazes me what some people will do for that buzz and the thrill they get from it. I do feel sorry for Peter. I mean, he was lonely and hurting and just wanted some release from it. But sadly, it all went wrong. You know, the odd thing is, most people think my job is all about screwing, but it isn't really. I would say in the last few years, most of the people who've had sessions with me have been like Peter. They were heartbroken and terribly lonely, and they missed the connection and the intimacy of having someone there for them. I could hear the sadness in her voice. She really cared about people, and that was the crazy thing about living here. Marjorie hated her, but why? Birch cared deeply for people. It made no sense to hate her at all. You know, Birch, the thing I don't get is you're opposed to marriage, and yet you see so much loneliness. Is that not a contradiction? Because surely marriage is the cure. She looked at me and her eyes looked so sad. It's not a cure, Dads. Most marriages force other people to be who they are not, and that is done through enforced monogamy, and I do not agree with it. You know, I've seen so many where one person sets the terms and the other has to comply and feels an inner loss to some aspect of themselves. I mean, look, it does work for some, but we see it as the only way as a society. And that is just simply not true. There are many ways people can raise their young or share a life. If you look at the whole of this planet, you'll find the Western ideals of marriage are but just one way. Many cultures remove shame from sex and marriage, and it works. I'm not against marriage. I'm against the ideal that society says monogamous marriage is the only way. Because honestly, it's not. She fascinates me every day. With her is a learning curve and a window into a wider world. Not just into her, but also into me. In a brief moment in the story, which it is, it's also a really important one, as Birch holds a mirror up to society and shows the truth of life. It is funny, really. People buy a book and sit reading it in chunks, putting it down and picking it up again, lost for a moment in another world or another time. And they see a reflection of themselves somewhere within those pages. And in doing so, hopefully, they gain joy. And at the same time, I really do hope that they learn something about who they are and who they want to be. It really is the true beauty of reading stories. All of us are capable of living thousands of different lives, And within all of that is the truth of our humanity. Because we do learn through books. We do experience other ways of living and being. And it is my hope we all become better people because of it. I spend thousands of hours sat alone at my desk, either writing or carefully choosing the words and the phrasing as I look at the world and reflect on all that I see. And those are the seeds, I suppose, that I plant to germinate within the reader. It's such a special experience, and I gain a great deal from knowing that even though I'll never really be a bestseller, out there, a few people have read my words, and it has enhanced their life, even if they do not always realize it. I think that really is the true magic of writing. But I also think, as the author, the magic is not quite enough. In order to create the things that I publish, I do feel I give a small part of my life and a small part of my soul to the words that I put onto the paper. If you've made it all the way through this podcast, listening to that, then I want to say a really, really big thank you to you for listening in today. And if you really like what you hear, please like the video. And if you've not already done so, then it would be wonderful if you would subscribe to the channel so that I can get the channel to grow and get more and more people listening in to the podcast. Thank you for being here and listening to this. I do greatly appreciate it. And I will pop off and I will come up with something illuminating and hopefully inspiring for next week's episode. And I will see you then.
Thanks for listening to the Writer Life podcast. If you have enjoyed this episode, or there are areas of Robin's stories you would like him to discuss, please add your thoughts and questions in the comments, and we will include them in a future episode. You can follow Robin on all his social media links, which you will find listed below, and please, like and subscribe to this channel, so you get the latest notifications when he posts. All Robin's books are available in digital and print formats to purchase or download through all online book sales sites.